Would you like to know the future if you could? It's a question I'd like you to contemplate this morning is, would you like to know the future? Men have always wanted to know the future, and they've paid at times a lot of money to people who claim to know the future to find out what it is for them. People will go to their horoscopes, meant to be 1 out of 12, based on the day that you were born. And they'll go to their horoscopes in the newspapers so that they will be able to know something about their future. It's interesting that is a very, very old practice, going way back to the Greeks. This idea of studying the stars and see how they line up and if they can predict your future. Now, why are people so interested in these things? What is it about the future that is so attractive to us? And I think one of the main reasons for this is our lives can change overnight. You can be going through life just seeming a steady pace and everything seems to be ticking along, and then overnight your whole life can change. And I think it's the uncertainty of the future and fear of what might be coming that attracts people and makes them interested in knowing the future. Jesus Christ, he knew his future. And in the text that Christopher read for us, he knew what was coming to him. He told the disciples in Mark 10:33, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests, the scribes, and they'll condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. They'll mock him, scourge him, spit on him, and kill him. And on the third day he'll rise again." I find it interesting how detailed Jesus is in regards to his future here. And that he knows specifically the things that are going to be done to him in Jerusalem. And it's interesting as they're traveling on this road to Jerusalem, and as he faces this horror where he's at within the group. Verse 32 says, "Now they're on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed." The idea here is, when it talks about him going before them, it wasn't that he was just casually, for some reason, ahead of the group, but he was pressing on, determined, driving forward to Jerusalem and to the cross. And what's the significance of this? Well, I think it helps us to understand his attitude towards his future. His attitude towards the future that he faced, and even though it was a difficult one, was one of boldness, one of fearlessness, one of commitment, one of determination, one that was uncompromising and heroic, because he was going to the cross. Now, was he a robot? Was he like a Terminator robot walking through the fire of suffering? No, we know that's not true. Christ was 100% man. But he was also 100% committed to the work of salvation for the rest of us. And how did the disciples feel when they saw Jesus pressing on to Jerusalem? Well, they were amazed at that. And why were they amazed at that? It's because they knew what they faced in Jerusalem. They didn't grasp the enormity of it. They didn't maybe accept what was ahead, but they knew when he went to Jerusalem, they knew who were waiting there for him. They knew his enemies. They knew the kind of people that they were dealing with when they arrived in Jerusalem. And they were afraid. But why were they afraid? Well, I think personal safety had to be a factor. They knew the opposition. They knew that these leaders in Israel were ruthless killers. And anyone going into a life and death situation, a confrontation like this, there'd be something wrong with them if they weren't afraid. But how did they respond to Jesus? When he set his face towards Jerusalem and led them forward, they followed him. And they followed him into serious trouble. And why was that? What drove them to follow him? I put it to you, it's because they loved him. It's because they loved him. Did they love him perfectly? No. They didn't love him perfectly. But they loved Christ more than they feared their fears. That's what they did. They loved him. Now, what's the future hold for us? Well, I think God has not laid that burden upon us, because he's gracious to us, and he just gives us one day at a time to deal with. But we have been given knowledge from Christ about what lies ahead of us. We know that our future is cross-shaped. There's a cross ahead of us, and a cross-shaped experience ahead of us. Now, we live in a religious world that wants to deny that. There's hardship and suffering and trials ahead of us. They don't like that idea. They want to offer us empty promises of ease and a life that is filled with blessing. A word that has been such abused today, that has become known as health, wealth, and prosperity. But we know this is a lie, because Christ said to us, there's a cross. There's a cross ahead of us. And Jesus never hid that from his disciples. As they were on their way to Jerusalem and were afraid, Jesus took them aside and told them in the midst of their fear, the details of what was coming, the horror that was ahead of them. Jesus never hid it, and he's never hid the cross from us. In fact, he calls us to count the cost. If we're going to be his disciple, we're to take up the cross and follow him. And with this knowledge of a hardship and trial and suffering ahead of us, we can become afraid. We can let fears take hold of us. But even in the midst of our fears, even when we're afraid, we're still going to follow Christ. We're going to do what the disciples have always done. We're going to follow Christ regardless. And why is that? Why are we going to prioritize Jesus above our own fears? And it's not because we're burdened down with guilt. It's not because we are working our way to heaven. It's not because we're the good people and the rest of the world have lost their way and they're in darkness, and we're the holy select of God, so we're going to hold on to Jesus till the end. It's not for any of those reasons. We're going to follow Jesus because we love him. We love him. We love him more than we love ourselves, more than we love our own lives. We love him. We love Jesus more then we're afraid of our fears. We're going to follow him regardless of what comes our way. We're following Christ into a cross-shaped future because we love him. Perfectly? Well, we know that's not true. But we would like to. We would like to. In our best moments, we would like to love him perfectly. And we're working on it. But we love him more than we love life itself. And are we ready to follow him wherever he leads? Yes. Yes. We're going to follow. If it's suffering, yeah. We don't care. We're following Jesus. We're following him to the cross, if that's what it takes. Because we know he's not going to give us anything more than we can bear. But we know at the end of the cross, on the other side of this, there's resurrection. And we're going to follow him into that resurrection too. Is it important to remember, regardless of our struggles, we're still following Christ? I think it's a jugular thing for a Christian. Because I think at times what can happen to me, and it may happen to you, in the midst of our trials and in the midst of our suffering and in the midst of bearing the cross, we can get down on ourselves. We can start to get down on ourselves and critical of ourselves because we're not performing as we would like in the midst of our trials. We have to be very careful of that as disciples of Christ, because we can get consumed with our own failure and our own sin and miss the Christ who's crucified and risen from the dead. Now, who would want us to do that? But our enemy. So how do we keep a clear head and not get bogged down on my performance or your performance? Well, it comes down to remembering. It comes down to remembering that Christ is bigger than my moral performance. He's more important than that. Christ is more important than my maturity and where I'm at in the faith. He's more important than me. And Christ is more significant than my sin. My sin. He's more significant. So my focus needs to be on him. I started to watch a show, it was last year. It's an interesting one. It's called Alone. In the reality show Alone, they take all these survival experts and they drop them up into some island outside Canada or Alaska or whatever, and all they get is the tools to survive alone. And they're competing with each other to see who can survive for the longest. Now, there's a prize of $500,000 at the end of it. But as a reality show goes, they really seem to work on this one to make it as real as possible. There's a whole starvation process people will go through just to win this thing. You'll see the weight dropping off. They can't catch a fish, they don't eat. I realized I'd probably last about 24 hours on that show before I'd be getting called. I'd be calling them, okay, get me out of here. But most of these people have been very highly trained. Some of them are for the military, some of them it's their career, so they drop them on there and then they log who lasts. Interesting show. One thing I've noticed about it though, as I've watched the competitors, is it's not just the physical trials, the hardships of just putting food on the table or getting fresh water or staying warm in the winter, because they go through all of that and the dangers. The real struggle for a lot of them is to be alone, to be away from their family, be away from their loved ones, be away from their wife or their husband and their kids. And it's interesting how many of them can build shelters, how many of them can eat or find food to eat, how many of them can, weather everything, but they'll give up because they can't just be alone. When the disciples, and loneliness is the struggle, but when the disciples were told they were going into a life and death situation, they were afraid. That fear did not trump their love for Christ. They weren't facing a terrifying future alone, because Christ went ahead of them. He was with them at that time as they went to Jerusalem, but he was leading them into their tribulation. Now, at times I might feel, and you might feel, that you're alone in your struggles. I at times feel that I'm alone in my trials, and at times it seems like I'm alone in my fears. And at times it looks like I'm alone in my tribulation. But it only looks that way. It only feels that way. It only seems that way, that we are alone in our suffering. Because like the disciples, we don't go into a difficult future by ourselves. Jesus is with us. Christ leads us. We're not alone, regardless of how we feel. And regardless of what's ahead of us, whatever the suffering, whatever the trial, even in death itself, we do not go into this alone. We go with Jesus. He leads us. He says this, I will never leave you or forsake you. Never leave you or forsake you. And in Matthew 28:7, he says, I'll be with you even to the end of the age. That's Christ's commitment to you and I. And Christ, if he does anything, he keeps his commitments. Now, when it comes to the cross and his suffering, what's Christ's attitude to the cross that he faced? When he looks to his future, a future that he knew, he meets it head on. He drives directly into it. As we said, he was not a robot. He was 100% man, 100% God in the flesh, committed to the work of salvation. That's what's driving him on. And the cross wasn't a suicide mission. He wasn't driving onto the cross as a suicide mission. He was driving on to conquer it, to defeat it, to beat what opposed him. That's what Jesus was doing. And in today's society, what attitude are we supposed to have towards certain suffering, hardship, and death? Well, death is the thing you're not allowed to talk about. But even in the midst of hardship and suffering, we have a saying, run, hide, and fight. I saw that plastered on the internet one day, and I have a picture, I think it's still on here, that they put up with it, of people cowering underneath tables in the face of their terror. Is that how we are going to live life? Is that what we're going to do? Because we have a cross to bear ahead of us? Is that the kind of men or women we are? I don't think we are. I think we're following Jesus because we want to be like Jesus. And Jesus takes it head on. Christ rises up to the cross that's ahead of him and he drives into it. And we must as well. See, Christ didn't go to the cross as a suicide mission. He went there to conquer it. And that's why we're on this earth, to beat whatever hardship or suffering or cross that the Father gives to us. We're here to conquer it, to beat this life. We're not in the running and hiding and cowering business. We're Christians. And by Christ and his grace, as he goes before us into this cross-shaped future, Christ is going with us. And he's going before us. And he's going to beat whatever the cross is you and I have to bear. It's interesting what Christ's solution is to the fear of his disciples. He does not hide from them what's ahead. He tells them he's going to die, he's going to be buried, he's going to be abused and go through all kinds of trials, but he tells them that he's going to raise from the dead. And when the disciples, who didn't understand it, he later experienced his resurrection. In their teachings, they talked about nothing else. Nothing else. But the death, the burial, and the resurrection. Now, what did Christ institute for us? What did Jesus do to bring us back to the resurrection? Well, he instituted this supper. On this first day of the week, on Resurrection Day, he gave us a resurrection meal. Why? Well, I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's because I'm an idiot. Because I forget. Because for some reason, the greatest truth in the history of humanity, in the history of my life, your life, and all of our lives, just passes by me. So Jesus took the truth and put it in this supper in a concrete form. That the blood that he shed on the cross, that the body that he broke on the cross for our sins, he took it up again on the third day. And in this supper, he speaks to us and he says, yes, there's a cross ahead for you. And there's one for me. And there's difficulties and there's suffering. But there's resurrection. Not just resurrection when he comes, but the power of his resurrection working in you and I, that we might defeat whatever comes our way, and that we might beat it. We might overcome this world through Christ and through Christ alone. In this supper, he says to us as we take it, he says, you're not alone. Regardless of how you feel. Regardless of how it seems. Regardless of what the world says. They're all lying. Christ is with you. He's with us. Together as his people. And he's driving ahead of us. Leading us into this cross-shaped future. Not as a suicide mission. But it might be defeated and overcome by Christ, through us, and to his glory. Let's bow together as we give thanks for the bread.